as large as this, though, for several years now. Was something this size predicted, even though you couldn't actually pinpoint exactly when?
Yeah, we have to be very careful with the word predicted. We can't say how big an earthquake will be, when it's going to occur. As you say, we can't pinpoint it. But in this area, we do expect earthquakes of this magnitude. In 2009, we had the L'Aquila earthquake of 6.3, and there's been 20 to 30 of these called sort of large magnitude events in the last 700 years or so. So it is common they happen. And
does it mean that when the strength gets beyond 6, that's when significant damage, devastation like this happens? So smaller tremors don't actually lead to structural damage like this?
Yeah, so I mean, in this area, around magnitude, around 5.6, you start getting surface events. So that's where they actually break the surface. So above that, you start getting significant damage. But to cause the sort of scenes we're seeing where you have total building collapse and buildings destroyed like this, yeah, around magnitude 6 or larger is what you'd expect.
And the fact that this was shallow as well, that increases the strength and destruction on the ground,
It does significantly, because more energy reaches the surface, the waves are bigger, and so much more damage will happen.
The buildings here, I mean, a lot of them are very old. These are beautiful little hilltop towns. Some of the houses built several hundred years ago. Presumably, there's very little you can do to strengthen buildings like that for an earthquake and the risk of earthquakes.
Yeah, so I mean, if you have a building that you're building new, you can do a lot more. You can put it on dampeners, you can make it from reinforced concrete. These buildings are made of masonry, brick, stone, without reinforcements, and it's very hard to reinforce them, especially if they're buildings of historic interest. You don't necessarily want to put on very visual, sort of ugly reinforcements. They have in the area done that in lots of areas. So following the L'Aquila earthquake, for example, there was a big project to try and protect schools and other critical buildings with cross-bracing, but these are sort of large, sort of X-shaped metal beams, which doesn't work on the beautiful historical buildings.
And the fact now that aftershocks are being felt, just explain the difference between an aftershock and another earthquake, a proper earthquake.
So an aftershock is very much triggered from the main event itself, and they will be very close to where the earthquake happened. So typically within 1 or 2 what we call fault distances from the earthquake. So however long the fault is, it's going to be within that distance from the original quake. Typically they'll only be up to maybe magnitude 1 less than the earthquake. So for this, if it was a magnitude 6.2, we won't see them bigger than 5 point something. And they'll also decrease over time. So a lot will be being felt at the moment, but every day there'll be fewer and fewer number of aftershocks. What we also get in this region, unfortunately, what we can get, so it's not necessary that it will happen, but it could happen, are what we call triggered events, which is what you just mentioned. And this is where the stress from an earthquake on one fault can actually cause an increase in the likeliness of an earthquake on another fault nearby. And we have seen this in Italy in the past, in the historical record. And actually in this region in 1703, there were 3 earthquakes in January and February between magnitude around 6 and 6.7. Obviously, we don't have instrumental measurements, but we sort of estimate it from the shaking. So it is an area where you can see these chain events. And in that case, they're further away, and they can actually be even larger than the first event. So that's why they're not aftershocks, but we are also at risk of them too.
So they need to be vigilant and alert from...
Very, very vigilant, and especially where you have buildings that have already been damaged. Now, there's sort of 2 ways of looking at it. A building that has stood up to this earthquake, you might say, oh, actually it's stronger, it's not going to fall down, it's proved itself. But there is another side, which is buildings that can look safe, and you think they look okay, actually might really be on that triggering point where a smaller aftershock could actually cause really significant damage. And we've actually seen that when we went in the field after the L'Aquila earthquake, where buildings from the outside almost looked untouched and actually completely destroyed on the inside. So it's very important that people talk to trained engineers and make sure they know, not to go in without having professional advice.
OK, Joanna Faure Walker, thanks very much indeed for joining us on the programme. Well, fundraising efforts to help those affected have begun. The town of Amatrice, where James Reynolds is, was due to hold a festival this weekend in praise